You light a cigarette, or maybe you do not, but you have watched someone else do it. That quick ritual of flame and smoke and a slow exhale. It feels like a distinctly modern habit, tangled up with lighters and packaging and warning labels. But the real answer is far stranger. Humans have been inhaling burning plant smoke on purpose for tens of thousands of years, long before anyone called it smoking. Long before anyone thought of it as a habit at all. So when did this actually start? And why does a behavior this old still have such a powerful grip on you today? Start with the deep past, because the timeline is older than almost anyone expects. Archaeologists have found charred plant residue and specialized smoking pipes dating back thousands of years across multiple continents, but the practice of intentionally inhaling smoke likely predates even those artifacts by a wide margin. Researchers studying the ritual use of psychoactive plants suggest that early humans were burning aromatic herbs and inhaling the resulting smoke as far back as the Upper Paleolithic, tens of thousands of years ago, primarily for spiritual, medicinal, and social reasons rather than casual recreation. Why would anyone start doing this in the first place? Fire itself holds the answer. Once early humans controlled fire reliably, likely somewhere between 400,000 and 1 million years ago, according to archaeological evidence reviewed by researchers like Richard Wrangham. They were surrounded by smoke constantly. Cooking fires, warming fires, fires that kept predators away through long nights. Smoke was not something you sought out. It was something you already breathed every single day of your life. This matters more than it might seem. Anthropologist Andrew Sherratt, who studied the archaeology of psychoactive substance use extensively, proposed that many early smoking practices likely emerge from a simple observation. Certain plants, when thrown onto a fire, produced smoke that changed how people felt. Dizziness, altered awareness, a different emotional state in a world without pharmacies or chemistry. This discovery would have looked less like science and more like magic. Consider what that meant socially. If burning a specific plant made you feel something distinctly different, calmer, more alert, disoriented in a specific and repeatable way, that plant became valuable. Not as food, as something else entirely. Something with power. This is where smoking and ritual become almost inseparable in the archaeological record. Sites across the Americas show evidence of tobacco use dating back several thousand years, often tied directly to religious and ceremonial contexts rather than everyday habit. Researchers studying indigenous cultures throughout North and South America have documented how tobacco smoke was frequently used to communicate with spirits, mark important transitions like coming of age or death, and seal agreements between groups. Smoking, in this context, was not something you did alone, absent-mindedly, while scrolling through your thoughts. It was something you did deliberately, often with other people, as an act loaded with meaning. Here's a detail that reframes the entire habit. The earliest smoking was rarely about pleasure in the way you might think of it today. It was about transformation. Multiple ethnobotanical studies have documented shamanic traditions across different continents where smoke inhalation was specifically used to induce altered states of consciousness, believed to allow communication with ancestors, spirits, or the natural world. The smoke was not the point. The state it produced was the point. So how did something built around ritual and altered consciousness turn into the compulsive, everyday habit you might recognize now? The answer lies in a substance most early smoking practices did not heavily feature at all. Nicotine. Tobacco contains high concentrations of nicotine, a compound that interacts directly with receptors in the brain associated with reward, focus, and mood regulation. Researchers studying the neuroscience of nicotine, including work compiled by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, have found that nicotine triggers the release of dopamine in specific brain pathways, the same general reward system involved in other reinforcing behaviors. This means that unlike many purely ceremonial smoking plants, tobacco created something new, a biochemical loop. Use it, feel a reward, want to use it again. This is the pivot point. Ritual practices tend to be occasional, tied to specific events or seasons, but once a plant hijacks a reward pathway this directly, the behavior starts to detach from ceremony and attach itself to routine. What began as something sacred and infrequent had the biological ingredients to become something else. Frequent, personal, eventually isolated from any larger meaning at all. There is a genuinely counterintuitive twist buried in this history. The modern image of smoking as an isolated private habit, one cigarette, one person, repeated throughout a stressful day, is almost the exact inversion of how the behavior started. Early tobacco and smoke rituals were deeply communal. Pipes were often passed between multiple people in a specific order, reinforcing social bonds and shared experience. Some researchers studying ceremonial pipe use among indigenous North American groups have noted that the act of sharing a pipe carried symbolic weight tied to unity, trust, and mutual respect between individuals or groups. You were not smoking to escape a moment alone. You were smoking to connect with the people around you in a structured, meaningful way. Compare that to how smoking often looks today: a single person. A quick break. Smoke exhaled alone, often specifically to create a brief pause from other people, not to bond with them. The physical act barely changed. The social context around it changed almost completely. This raises an important question about why the habit persisted so powerfully once it spread globally, particularly after European contact with the Americas introduced tobacco to a much wider population starting in the 15th and 16th centuries. Historians studying this period note that tobacco spread through European society remarkably quickly, initially marketed and consumed for supposed medicinal properties before becoming a widespread recreational habit. The ritual context faded rapidly outside its origin cultures. The nicotine and the reward loop it created did not fade at all. It traveled easily, attached itself to new cultural habits, and eventually settled into the daily, often solitary pattern most familiar today. Think about what this reveals about the difference between a behavior's origin and its persistence. Something can begin as a rare, sacred, carefully controlled act and end up as a routine driven almost entirely by a rewiring effect on the brain. The meaning can disappear almost completely while the underlying chemical mechanism keeps operating exactly as it did when it was first discovered around a fire tens of thousands of years ago. There's also a broader pattern here worth sitting with. Humans have a long history of discovering that certain plants alter consciousness in specific, repeatable ways, then building elaborate cultural and social structures around those discoveries. Alcohol, certain fermented foods, various plant-based stimulants, and hallucinogens all follow a similar arc in different parts of the world. What starts as a rare, ritualized encounter with something that changes how the brain feels often gradually becomes something more embedded in daily life, sometimes losing most of its original context along the way. This pattern shows up clearly if you look at how quickly commercial cigarette production reshaped smoking once industrialization made mass manufacturing possible in the 19th and 20th centuries. What had taken tens of thousands of years to develop as an occasional ceremonial practice became, within a few generations, one of the most widespread daily habits in human history, driven less by ritual meaning and more by manufactured accessibility combined with that same ancient nicotine reward loop discovered long before written history existed. There is another layer to this story worth exploring, and it concerns not tobacco specifically, but the wider category of plants humans chose to burn and inhale across different parts of the world. In parts of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, resins like frankincense and myrrh were burned in religious contexts for thousands of years, producing fragrant smoke used in temples and sacred spaces long before written language recorded the practice. Researchers studying ancient trade routes have found that these aromatic resins were valuable enough to shape entire economies, transported across vast distances specifically because of how their smoke was used in ritual settings. This tells you something important. The impulse to burn a substance and inhale its smoke for a specific effect, whether spiritual, medicinal, or social, was not confined to any single culture or continent. It emerged independently, again and again, in societies that had no contact with one another, suggesting something fundamental about how the human brain responds to inhaled compounds combined with fire and ceremony. It is also worth examining what made tobacco specifically so different from these other ritual smoke plants once nicotine's reward properties became, in effect, biologically load-bearing. Many ceremonial plants produce effects that fade without leaving behind a strong compulsion to repeat the experience immediately. Nicotine behaves differently. Researchers studying addiction and dependence have found that nicotine's effects on the brain's reward circuitry are unusually fast-acting and unusually short-lived, compared to many other psychoactive substances, meaning the pleasurable or calming effect arrives quickly but fades quickly too. This specific combination, fast reward, fast fade, creates ideal conditions for repeated use throughout a single day rather than occasional ritual use tied to a specific ceremony. In a strange way, the pharmacology of nicotine itself may have played a quiet role in pulling tobacco out of its original ceremonial context and into something closer to constant, low-level repetition. There is a psychological dimension to this shift as well, one that connects directly to how humans regulate stress and attention throughout an ordinary day. Modern research into nicotine use has found that many smokers report using cigarettes specifically during moments of transition, a break at work, a pause during a difficult conversation, a brief escape from a demanding task. This pattern echoes something ancient without most smokers realizing it. Early ceremonial use of smoke plants was also frequently tied to transitions, marking the boundary between ordinary time and sacred time, between one life stage and another. The modern cigarette break, stripped of any spiritual framing, still often functions as a small ritual marking a shift from one mental state to another. The context changed almost entirely. The underlying human impulse to use smoke as a marker of transition appears to have persisted in a much smaller, quieter form. Or think about your own relationship with a habit that feels intensely personal and modern. Consider what you are actually looking at. Not a purely modern invention, not a simple bad habit invented by a tobacco company in the last century. You're looking at the tail end of an extremely long lineage, one that started around fires tens of thousands of years ago, in rituals meant to connect people to each other and to something larger than themselves. The ritual mostly disappeared. The smoke And the ancient reward system, it quietly hijacks every single time, never really left at all.